I have this proposal. How long is it gonna take to implement this? Developers tend to not want to answer this question. For the developer, trust me, it is a hugely complicated question. They might have a rough idea of how long it's probably gonna take, but then they know that pretty much with anything they implement, there's always something that comes up, always something weird that happens. And so I want to explain to you what is this that's going through their mind. Are you a product manager or a project manager working with developers? Then chances are you are often in meetings with developers and you ask them the question, what will it take you to implement this? The answer is usually very vague. Developers avoid this question. My goal with this video is to explain to you why that is. Now, I don't know if you have ever seen any code in your life, but it doesn't really matter because we'll go over the extreme basics of web development in a way that everybody will be able to understand. We'll also take a look at the general workflow of a programmer. We'll talk about the problems that they encounter and how they solve them. And at the end, we'll briefly discuss estimations as a task that the programmer is asked to perform, as well as refactoring. Maybe you've already heard that we divide between backend and front-end development, and there's often some confusion around what that actually means. I will put it very simply. In the space of web applications, what we mean by front-end is anything that the user sees in their browser, such as Chrome, Safari, or Firefox. This includes the content that is shown there, the text, the tables, the images, videos, and so on, but it also includes the interactivity, so that when you click on some button, for example, something happens and changes on that website. This is roughly it, and you can think of everything else as backend development. And the backend is things like the web server, which is the program that runs on some computer in the cloud that actually sends you the website itself, the main document and everything else, when you access the web application using your browser. And you enter the address such as app.product.com. The server sends you this HTML document, whatever that means. And then the backend doesn't only include this web server, but usually also a database. And the database is where we store things like user accounts, companies, and whatever data is associated with them. So this helps us to, for example, when the user visits the page the second time, we still know who they are. We can have them log in and save this data and sort of track them over time. And then also we store any other data depending on our business. Really, this could be a lot of different things. That's the power of databases. So you could say front end, web server, database. Those are usually the main components that you need to think about. What matters more for you than the details of this infrastructure is how the development process works, because that'll impact who can actually estimate what, who can know which things, and so on. And it also will impact what the developer has to do depending on the feature that they're asked to implement. You could have distinct roles, specifically front-end developers and back-end developers, or you could have a combined role which is usually called full-stack developer, where they have to implement both sides, handle both sides. It will also depend on the feature that they're asked to implement, the actual task that they're asked to perform, especially if the task involves a lot of new data and new kinds of ways to interact or show this data. This means that there could be a lot of effort involved with this, because changes to the back-end side of things usually involve a lot more effort. Why is that? The reason is that changes to the backend, especially changes to the database, will propagate to the front end. And then the front end needs to be adjusted to accommodate these new ways of modeling your reality. Of course, this won't always be the case, and you still need developers to think about exactly what needs to be done, and that's fine, but just keep this in mind whenever you think about changing data, adding data. This might be more complicated. And it goes to show that it's not necessarily a good idea to assume that any feature should be implemented in a certain way. There are usually different possible approaches, and one option might be significantly easier to implement And this might be for different reasons. So generally speaking, not always, but generally speaking, if you manage to design a feature in a certain way that requires only changes to the front end, you might end up saving the developer a lot of time. And of course, this also means that you'll get the features shipped a lot faster to your customers. All right, so I've spoken a little bit in abstract terms now, and I can imagine that you don't really understand what I was just talking about. So let me show you exactly what I mean by this. It requires a little bit of an explanation of how websites work. So what is a website? You can actually think of a website as a sort of Word document. So you have a main document that contains all the text, links, tables, images, and so on. And just like the links in this Word document, you can also have buttons and other elements that you can actually click on or type text into. And when the user interacts in such a way with your Word document, we call this an event. And then we have event handlers that actually do something in reaction to what the user did. So generally, we have the user doing something, and that causes some chain of reactions. And lastly, it may also contain some images or videos, right, that are usually so big that we don't put them directly in the Word document, but we just reference them. So we just say, hey, we have stored this image in this cloud. This could be, you could imagine this as something like Dropbox, iCloud, Google Drive, right? And there we put images and videos usually, and those get referenced in the main document as, hey, we put this there. And then the browser goes and it finds this reference and it downloads images and videos and places them inside the document. And then we have two more important concepts that you should know about, which is primarily we have CSS. This is styling. And styling you can think of as the colors that the text has, for example, or background colors of some boxes. Everything you can see is styled using CSS. And this also includes sizes of things and the spacing. So it makes sure that there's enough space between individual boxes and the text so that the user doesn't get overwhelmed by what they're seeing. Finally, the third concept, and a very important concept, is the one that actually involves code. Web browsers generally understand only one language. This programming language is called JavaScript. And JavaScript is a so-called scripting language. What does that mean? This means your browser will download the entire script. It will download the whole code that is associated with our web application and will then run it as soon as it has downloaded. And this usually, these days, controls everything you can see on the page. So we're able to control the entire web page using code. This means we can swap out any element on the page and we can control which page we're on. We can switch between tabs. So it's very powerful. This is basically the centerpiece that our work revolves around as, let's say, front-end developers. Additionally, with JavaScript, what we can do these days is we can communicate with our backend. We can talk to our backend and ask it for the current state of our database. What is stored in the database right now? What is, for example, what is in my shopping cart, right? And it can also change the data in the database through the backend. It sends requests to the backend saying, hey, I want to change this data. Here's the new data. Here's the new product I want to add to my shopping cart, for example. And then this gets performed by the backend, and the backend might respond with, yeah, that worked. Good job. Or please buy. Yeah. So in other words, this code is extremely powerful and nowadays is a centerpiece where front-end developers do almost anything. Let's go over to estimation. I already mentioned that how much effort a development task takes is largely dependent on whether it's a front-end only change or also requires back-end changes. But that's just a tiny part of estimation. It depends on many more potential risk factors. Some of these are quite predictable. On the more predictable side, we have things like, does this feature need to be tested? Is it a change to a feature that requires changing existing tests? how many existing tests are affected by such a change? And will they need to be adjusted with a lot of effort? To know that, we need to understand how our tests work. And we often do this with so-called end-to-end tests. End-to-end tests are programs that pretend to be users. So these programs use our web app just like a user. They open different pages, enter some data, and click on buttons. And in those end-to-end tests, we check that the application does and keeps doing what we intended to do. Now you can imagine when you have hundreds or thousands of these test sequences that these programs might break in some way when, for example, we move some button around on the page or replace it by something else, because then the program does not find the button anymore, for example. So in order to estimate the impact on these tests, a developer needs to recall what the tests currently do and what exactly they do. And again, these might be a lot of tests. So of course, we run the risk that we forget about some tests, or we forget about some part of the code base that we're just not thinking about, but that is highly relevant to the change that we need to make. There are many more such risk factors, and if you're interested in knowing more about them, let me know in the comments down below so I know I should be making a video about them. Thank you so much. Over time, the more changes we make to our code base, it becomes more complex and harder to change. And one way we try to reduce these risks that are associated with changing such a complex code base and understanding it, and delays that come with not being able to understand it fast enough and to grasp the code base and its current state before we actually dive into it and try to implement something, is called refactoring. So all code is essentially a list of instructions for the computer. It's a list of steps that the computer should execute, should perform. And what this means is it's very fixed. It codifies and it defines a fixed way of doing things, essentially. And so this means that the more code we add, the more restrictions we actually put in place on how to perform certain things. And refactoring is a way to change these restrictions. It's a way for us to be able to change code so we don't have to conform to the restrictions that we put in place before by removing the restrictions, by reorganizing the code. Essentially, refactoring has the goal of keeping the functionality intact, keeping all the features intact so they work exactly the same as before, but changing the layout and the structure of the code so that we're able to understand it better and to make the changes that we need to make. And that's where this adage comes from that says, first make the change easy and then make the easy change. And this of course takes time, and as developers we want to take this time quite often so that we can prevent our code base from becoming too complex. So you can see refactoring as a sort of way to reduce risks. You need to take it quite seriously. And it's a good practice to actually dedicate time every sprint or every month or whatever where they can actually make these refactorings, because sometimes they may not do that by themselves, although I would argue it's actually a part of the job of a developer to ensure that refactoring gets done either way. It may need to be done as part of the implementation of some story, which you may prefer or may not prefer, so it's up to you to decide to dedicate extra time or not.